Welcome, all of you in your homes. My name is Dorothea von Moltke, and I am one of the owners of Labyrinth Books here in Princeton. I'm very excited to be able to introduce Kirstin Valdez Quade and A.M. Holmes in a minute. They are here, of course, to talk about Kirstin's absorbing new novel, The Five Wounds. I only have an advanced reader's copy, so the real thing is actually even nicer in hardback. The Five Wounds had its seed in a short story by the same title that was published in The New Yorker a few years back. Some of you might have seen that and remember it. I want to begin, though, as always, with some thank yous to our community partners. One of the most rewarding aspects, really, of the events that we host at Labyrinth is that they connect us with community partners, with others who share our commitment to the world of books. So Labyrinth and the Princeton Public Library partner every season on several occasions in our Labyrinth and the Library Live series. So now online and in other times in both of our spaces. And tonight's conversation is a part of that series. Warm thanks also to the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton University. And they're also co-sponsors. And I want to mention that Labyrinth, the library and the Lewis Center have another exciting event planned in just a few weeks' time on May 3rd, when Jhumpa Lahiri will be reading from her new novel and discussing that. So be sure to register for that as well. We will leave time for your questions after Kirstin and A.M.'s conversations. So please just take a second to find the Ask a Question button. It's at the bottom of your screen. That is where you can put any and all questions in the queue as you think of them. And finally, the last practical note, there is another button above the Ask a Question button, a long one. Click on that to buy a signed copy of The Five Wounds from Labyrinth, and you can get 10% off if you enter Quade at checkout. If you prefer to order over the phones or by email, I've put information for that, for what you need for that at the top of the chat. But on now to our guests, two celebrated writers who are also colleagues. Kirstin Valdez Quade is the author of Night at the Fiestas, which won the John Leonard Prize from the National Book Critics Circle, the Sue Kaufman Prize for Fiction from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a 5 Under 35 award from the National Book Foundation, and it was a finalist for the New York Public Library Young Lions Award. I should say it's a short story collection. It was also named a New York Times Notable Book and a Best Book of 2015 by the San Francisco Chronicle and the American Library Association. So all to say, this is about as much fanfare as a book can get, and I expect similar things for The Five Wounds. Kirstin's work has appeared in The New Yorker, the Best American Short Stories, the O. Henry Prize Stories, the New York Times, and elsewhere. And she teaches creative writing at the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton University. And A.M. Holmes also teaches creative writing at the Lewis Center. How great that she's able to join Kirstin for this discussion. A.M.'s most recent book is Days of Awe, which we celebrated when it came out at Labyrinth, also a collection of short stories. She is the author of the novels This Book Will Save Your Life, which won the 2013 Orange Women's Prize for Fiction, of Music for Torching, The End of Alice, In a Country of Mothers, and Jack, as well as the short story collections Things You Should Know and The Safety of Objects. And if you don't know A.M. as a memoirist, you should find yourselves a copy of The Mistress's Daughter and of Los Angeles. And currently, A.M. is working on an opera, not her first. It's an opera about the suffrage movement for the Kennedy Center's 50th anniversary celebration. Just a couple words about The Five Wounds. Reading this novel with its really very moving portrait of the working poor, and maybe particularly spending time with one of its main characters, whose name is Amadeo, has made me think about the work of Lauren Berlant, who is a critic I really like, who has written a lot about the emotional dimensions of economic instability. but also about what she calls cruel optimism. Cruel optimism is the way that we are attached to ideas or fantasies, sort of including everything that gets summed up also by the American dream, that actually get in the way, as she says, of the very optimism you brought to them. And I guess what with this I'm trying to say is that Kirstin's characters, with their many flaws and their hopes, hopes which are as easily rekindled as they are dashed, with their burdens of shame and of hurt and their capacity for love, for wonder, with this rich and complex mix of proclivities and emotions, her characters open an affective and a really deeply affecting window into the conditions of the millions of American, growing millions, right, of Americans whose lives are defined by precariousness. And it's all to say that by spending time with the Padilla family, we come to understand some of the defining realities, I think, of our own time. So, and all of that in a way that's very memorable. So I encourage you all to read this extraordinary book. And here now are Kirstin, Kirstin Valdez Quade. Let me find you. Let's see. Hi, Kirstin. Welcome. I'm so happy that you're here.
Thank you, Dorothea. That was such a beautiful introduction. Thank you.
Oh, well, my pleasure. And AM, hi. Good to see you both. And I'm going to just take myself out of this view and hand things over and look forward to listening in.
Hello, Kirstin.
Hi,
it is such a treat to be here with you to celebrate the publication of this book that I remember when you're writing it. So it's a thrill. And I'm hoping you'll sort of start us off by reading a little bit from the book, and then we can talk, and then maybe you'll read a little more.
Sure, I'd be glad to. I'm so thrilled to be here. And Labyrinth was such a godsend during the pandemic. To be able to order books, and so it's really, really a joy to celebrate my book with Labyrinth and with all of you. So, as Dorothea said, the Five Wounds began as a story, and it follows Amadeo, who's an unemployed alcoholic. He is a deadbeat father, and he has been chosen to play the role of Jesus in the Good Friday procession in his small town of Las Penas, New Mexico. And he has in his head that if he does the very, very best job of playing Jesus, then he will truly transform his life. But his daughter shows up enormously pregnant and announces that she's moving in with him, and this derails all of his plans. At the end of the short story, he asks to have actual nails driven into his palms, and that upsets his daughter completely. And in the last moments of the story, he sees his daughter, and he has this epiphany that real transformation is to be found in his relationships with the people who depend on him. But one of the questions that kept dogging me and that inspired the novel was, so what happens the next morning? Mm-hmm. Does the epiphany actually stick? So this is a scene from the Easter dinner when the family gathers. Amadeo's sister apparently doesn't notice that he isn't speaking to her and hasn't since her obnoxious gift last Christmas. When Valerie comes in, she hugs him before he can dodge. Still gripping his arm, she steps back and takes Amadeo in. He almost can't look at her. The absurdly long hair hanging loose, the oversized earrings, the ambiguously ethnic scarf. And that superior, forbearing expression, as if she's willing to humor him, but only up to a point. Good to see you, little brother. Amadeo nods coolly, but she misses it because she's already turned to Angel. Oh my God, Angelica, let me see you. You're enormous. Angel ducks her head, pleased and a little shy. Hey, Aunt Val. Valerie hugs her, then crosses the living room to switch off the television. 2 years ago, Valerie got rid of her TV. If she's not making a big show of ignorance whenever someone mentions The Bachelor or a piece of celebrity gossip, then she's going on about some project one of the girls has done, with the endless stores of time and intellect and creativity endemic to television-free households. I don't know how you guys can hear yourselves think with that thing going all the time, she says, dusting off her hands. Armed with a brand new master's degree, Valerie is now a counselor in the Albuquerque public school system and is therefore an expert on everything. She took night and weekend classes for 3 years, and for 3 years she swanned around, sighing and rubbing her temples, talking about how overworked she was. She tosses around theories and diagnoses, pressing her lips. She says, nodding knowingly. She has the maddening tendency to read into even the most banal comments. If, for example, Amadeo says he wanted to kill the lady with the 600 coupons in front of him at the checkout, her eyebrows will pinch in concern. Are you having urges to hurt other people, Dodo? Amadeo's theory, and God knows he's no school counselor, is that Valerie never got over his birth, which means that she spent all but 5 years of her life resentful. Only 3 things make his sister bearable. First, she's gotten fat and she's self-conscious about it. Second, she was hit by her ex-husband, which makes her skittish around any displays of masculine strength, so Amadeo need only flex his fist or massage a bicep to disconcert her. Third, her kids are pretty cute, or used to be. Now that she's 12, Lily acts just as superior as her mom. She reads far beyond her grade level, no surprise given her glasses and frizzy mop of hair. She and her little sister are still standing in the doorway, the screen propped against their bottoms, staring solemnly at his beer and his bandaged hands, as if they're afraid to step all the way into the house with him there. Uncle Amadeo, erratic, mean, drunk. He can imagine what Valerie tells them. Watch out for Uncle Amadeo. Never get in the car with Uncle Amadeo. Whatever you do, don't end up like Uncle Amadeo. Before he can help himself, he's making a nasty face at them, mouth wide. Rah, he snarls, raspy and sudden. Lily flinches, then regains her composure and rolls her eyes behind her glasses. But Sarah, the 7-year-old, breaks into a delighted gap-toothed laugh. She's an adorable child, large-eyed with a sweet black bob, skinny legs poking out of soccer shorts. Amadeo grins back, his irritation transformed into affection for this niece who is, it seems, still too young to despise him. I'll stop there.
Wow. I just want to say, I haven't heard you read it yet. I so love reading it and then hearing you read it. It's amazing. I want to start with a sort of, in some ways, what's a back to the beginning question, which is that in 2009, you started this as a short story. And that question of what does the epiphany stick and what happens next? I want to hear a little bit about the evolution of that, because in many ways you could say sort of the novel itself begins, obviously where the story ended or where one would otherwise end something. So it's really already a new beginning. But can you talk a little bit about the evolution of these storylines over the years that it took to sort of shape it into a full-fledged masterpiece?
Sure. So for 2 years after it was published, I had zero thoughts of extending it into a novel. My editor had asked me early on if I ever considered it, and I said absolutely not. But 2 years after it was published, I was looking at some story drafts, and I realized that actually I was writing about the same basic constellation of characters, the same basic family dynamics, and sort of in a flash, I recognized Amadeo and Angel and Yolanda. They had different names in these drafts. And I thought, oh, wow, I'm not done with those characters. And so that summer I started work on it just to see what would happen. And, it was the story is focused entirely on Amadeo. It's his point of view. So it was a joy to get to know the other characters and to see that the world sort of expand around them.
It's wonderful because, one of the things I noticed in this too is that really the novel is charting the evolution of this family. And it really, it's during this Easter holiday, and it is from birth to death. And it is very much about sort of, if not resurrection, reinvention. And I was so curious about that and sort of those ideas that are often, and I know you've been asked about this, seen through sort of the Catholic lens, but I'm also curious to hear about it through the creative lens of what it meant to kind of chart I think of literature as often sort of going downhill. Like by the end of the book, everyone dies or everyone is, in a bad place. And yours actually circles around, and there is a sense of optimism or possibility. I'm curious how you got to that.
Well, I think in general, I'm a pretty optimistic person. And if literary fiction is about character change, and, that's what I tell my students, and I'm sure you do too, that, at the end of the story, something significant should have changed for your characters. And the fact that we can change, I think, is profoundly optimistic. Even if the story isn't necessarily happy, any understanding and growth and change, I think, is optimistic, is hopeful. It starts with a crucifixion. I mean, that's sort of the climax of the story of Jesus. There's the bigger climax, obviously, a couple days later.
Was there a moment even with the crucifixion where you thought, like, you had your own epiphany, you thought, I'm going to use real nails? Like, was there a breakthrough moment when developing Amadeo, and you thought, that's what it's going to take?
Yeah, Amadeo is a member of a Brotherhood of Penitentes, which is a lay community that practices physical penance. And it's a very old tradition in New Mexico. It dates back to the earliest Spanish presence. And these brotherhoods were really crucial to the fabric of these far-flung villages. They were mutual aid societies. They performed funerals when, there weren't enough priests for all of these isolated towns. And so these communities really filled that gap. And the practice still exists. And I've always found it to be really moving. The numbers are much smaller. It's not, the huge communities that they used to be in the 19th century. And I was reading about it, and I read there was a rumor in one of these histories I was reading. They were saying that, it has been said that sometimes there are actual crucifixions. And, these aren't documented cases, but when I read that, I thought, what depth of belief and need and desire would lead somebody to make that choice? And, what balance of faith and also real chutzpah to choose that. So that's, that Amadeo grew out of that. That is not a part of the practice as it is practiced typically.
I mean, I found Amadeo to be so compelling because in the beginning, he really is, he's lost to himself in many ways. And he's kind of given up on himself. And then, it's Yolanda, his mother, who sort of has persuaded the Brotherhood to kind of, as a last ditch effort, to sort of take him on. And then, you're right that if anyone would allow themselves to be truly crucified, it would be him, because he does need it that desperately, and he does need that connection and that sense of being valued in his community and in his world. And you do that so well. I'm curious to know, and this sort of leads me to another question, but what the experience of writing Amadeo, who obviously is very different from you as a person, what that was like and inhabiting that.
He is different from me, but there's some of me in there. I remember being in, processions and pageants in church as a kid, and once I was Mary and I had to carry the baby Jesus, and the whole time I was thinking of how angelic and pious I looked, and that I was the star of the whole show. And there is something of me and Amadeo. He was a hard character to write. He, especially in the beginning, when I started the story, I judged him and I wanted him punished. I thought he, I was so angry at him for having abandoned his daughter and mooching off of his mother, and I wanted the story to punish him. But you can't judge your characters that way. The story wasn't good until I could actually empathize with him and become him. So that was sort of an empathetic challenge for me. It was not always easy to be in his point of view, because he's an addict. He makes wrong choices. He knows he makes wrong choices, and that could be hard to be in his point of view, which made it so nice to be able to switch into Angel's point of view.
Do you want to go ahead and read a little bit? I have so many questions for you, but do you want to read a little bit from Angel's point of view, and then we'll jump back into questions?
Sure. I'll read just a couple pages from.
Yeah.
So this is set in Smart Starts, which is the teen parent program that Angel attends. She hasn't yet given birth at this point. Angel pinches the underside of her chin as she thinks. It's journaling time, and Brianna has told them to make a list of things they each need to make their own and their babies' lives better. The first few are easy. 1, GED or high school diploma and college degree. 2, a support system. 3, a car. 4, a driver's license. 5, a job. Here, Angel is stumped. If she got a job, who would take care of the baby? So she adds 6, free babysitter, a good one. But there's no such thing, not really, not unless your mom or grandma doesn't work. Even Angel knows that. Briefly, she considers her father, then dismisses the thought. Across the room, Christy and Trinity are whispering. They are best friends and knew each other from before Smart Starts. We got pregnant like the same month, they're always telling people, which is either a crazy fluke or an organizational feat. Both possibilities depress Angel. Who'd like to share? Asked Brianna. Today she wears her clunky sandals and a shapeless maroon sweater dress that is too heavy for outside. Jen raises her hand, tucking her silky, mousy hair behind her large white ears, preparing herself for the stage. An education, she says. Jen smiles, anticipating Brianna's praise. Right, drawls Lizette. Education, I forgot that one. Angel grins and tries to telegraph her approval to Lizette, but Lizette's beautiful green eyes are half closed like a lizard's. On her left hand, Jen wears a promise ring with a dinky little amethyst. It's my birthstone, she said, as if none of the rest of them were born in months with birthstones. She's going to marry her boyfriend, Jared, whom she met at church, and who picks her up every afternoon when Smart Starts lets out. Angel's stomach churns whenever she thinks of her own child's father, Ryan Johnson, the way in geometry he always sat in the front row, grimacing up at the board. He always raised his hand to answer questions, but was only correct about 50% of the time. It seemed crazy to Angel to keep putting yourself out there like that. But the next time Mrs. Esposito asked a question, there he was, long, skinny arms swinging in the air. Hey, he told her breathlessly once in the hall after class, I thought of a name for you, a math name. For weeks he called her Angle, or sometimes, delighting himself still further, obtuse Angle. He was so persistent she felt embarrassed for him, which, along with the tequila shots, explains why she slept with him. Her embarrassment also explains, perhaps, why she hasn't told him the baby is his.
I love that so much. Obtuse Angle. It's like we should all have math names. It's like having your drag name, only it's your math name.
It's true.
I know. There's so many questions I want to ask you. So, God, I don't even know where to sort of turn. I guess one of the things I think of you as writing really with almost like an eye that's like an anthropologist's eye, and it's sort of combining the sort of the scientific and the sort of witnessing of people with a kind of tenderness that is capturing the human heart. I mean, your characters are also, they're funny. There's heartbreak, and then there's incredible humor, like Obtuse Angle. It seems to me the humor is an important piece of it for you. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect?
Gosh, it's so important to me. I mean, these characters are in some difficult situations, and I think one of the ways they cope is with humor. And certainly in my own life, difficulty and humor have always gone hand in hand. That even in the saddest, most difficult moments, there have been elements of absurdity and humor. And I think it's sort of the way my family operates too.
Well, it allows one to tolerate some of the pain, really. One of the things I still want to hear you talk about too is there is a weave here between sort of the characters' personal and familial history and their experience of hardship, but also the larger cultural history of life in New Mexico. And you do that so deftly that on the one hand, we don't notice it, but it's so clear that there is a generational weight that these characters are carrying. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how you did that and the importance of it, obviously.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I continue to write about New Mexico, which is, where my family has been for 400 years since, the earliest Spanish presence, is that it has such a complicated history. I mean, there is such a history of really bloody, brutal conquest when the Spanish came in and, pushed the Native Americans off the land, enslaved, so many Pueblo people. And then, of course, there were other waves of conquest. There's sort of this, the Anglo ranchers who came in when it became clear that the ranch land was valuable. Right. And today, New Mexico has, one of the greatest disparities of wealth. I mean, there is such extreme poverty. And then, there are movie stars who have houses in Santa Fe and just outside. So, and when you're there, you feel it. I mean, there was an advertising slogan from the 50s for the New Mexico Tourist Board that said 3 cultures living in harmony. And it's, it's such a sad claim because there's so much pain. There's so much pain that is still palpable. And I think it does find its way into families, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you see it in these characters and especially in Yolanda and Amadeo carrying that weight. And you see it in the young people as well, in the sense of what their futures or what possibilities are open to them. I mean, I think I found it's so interesting that you're able to, in both the novel and your stories, sort of unpack questions about the politics of race and class and different kinds of privilege, and also the sort of the kind of privilege that goes unseen by those who have it. So they're not even aware, oh, I'm having a privileged moment here. And you do it in a way that's super, is incredibly deft. It's not reductive, it's not harsh. And I guess it brings me to a question that I often think about with a writer we both admire, Grace Paley. We used to talk about whether or not writers have a social responsibility or, an obligation to society to, I don't know, illuminate? I'm not even sure. What do you think?
I think it's a tricky question because I don't want, a piece of my fiction to be this treatise. I can write an essay for that. But my work is political. I think there's no way that it can't be. Partially just because I write about the community I write about. So there's no way for that not to trickle in. And these issues really matter to me. It's the plight of teenage mothers who aren't able to finish school. I think is just one of the greatest. It's just criminal that our country doesn't take care of our children. The fact that childcare is prohibitively expensive for so many families, and that so many working families have to put their children in childcare that isn't safe. And it's just wrong. So yeah, I think there's no way for that not to make it into my work.
Right, and that cycle too of where one has to abandon education in order to stay home with a family, and even, whether it's high school or college, people have families and they're in college, and one of the people has to stay home because somebody's got to be there. It's very complicated, absolutely.
Or even after, even if people do finish their educations,
Yes. Yes. Even during the pandemic, there's been all these studies that women have been among the hardest impacted because they've had to work and homeschool their children simultaneously. And we've all seen, some incredible Zoom moments of, people in a high level meeting, and all of a sudden they're interrupted by, the screaming, crying children. It's very, very complicated. And somehow you're right. It doesn't seem as though we value our children. Literally, and their education and their safety, which is a whole big complicated thing. But, another sort of political thread in the book is there is sort of a queer theme that comes through both in two characters. One who is of a generation for whom it would have been very difficult to come out, and the other is for a younger person for whom sort of the idea of a kind of fluidity seems much, much easier, but there's still some, cultural bias. And I guess I was curious about that thread in the book, which it's very subtle, but it's there.
Yeah, so, Angel falls in love with one of her classmates, one of the other teen mothers, Lizette, who I mentioned in that scene. And, so much of Angel's arc is sort of taking her own desire seriously. She began to have sex early, obviously. She's mother to an infant. But she wasn't for a while thinking about desire. And so that it becomes this sort of discovery for her. She doesn't, the idea of coming out to her family still feels pretty tricky for her. And she has pretty good reason to believe that her family might not accept her.
Yeah. Do you think she's aware of the history with the grandfather?
I don't. No. Yeah. To my mind, that's one of the sad things, is that, really the grandfather story gets lost.
Yeah. I think you did that beautifully, because it's sort of, it woven in ever so, again, deftly and in small places, but it clearly had a big impact, obviously, on the grandparents' marriage and how the grandfather moved through his life. And then Angel doesn't have the benefit of, this was this other gay person in the world. It's both kept secret and in some ways obviously erased. And so I think that is interesting, how one finds representation of themselves even in their own families. It's complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so damaging when these things have to remain a secret. Angel is close with her family, but she has to withhold this really important piece of herself.
Yeah.
At least for a time.
Right. And the girl who she falls in love with seems to have complicated feelings about that as well. That she doesn't sort of want that to be part of her identity. So it is so complicated. There's so many threads in this. Yolanda the grandmother and her boyfriend who, you know, I don't want to give things away, but who Yolanda then sort of abandons and then later is so happy with herself for being able to continue to hold him at bay because she's empowered. It gives her autonomy in her own life. There's just incredible, wonderful parts about it. I have a question for you that one of the things that we were talking about earlier today, there was a lunchtime talk by a writer named P. Carl. And one of the things that is coming up a lot in all of our classes is, do you have to have lived an experience in order to write about it? And it seems to me, on the one hand, the reason that we write is to, in part, to travel through the lives of others and to sort of understand them. But I think we're at such a complicated moment in time in terms of also wanting to make sure that people who haven't had a chance to tell their story have the space to do that. And so I guess I'm wondering how you navigate that area, both as an author and as a teacher, and how you sort of talk about that.
I mean, that's one of the trickiest questions, isn't it? I mean, you know, as fiction writers, of course, we're constantly embodying other human beings, taking on other experiences. You know, I've never had a child. I've never been, you know, a man. I've never been in my 50s and dying. Like I haven't been, so mostly all of my characters actually.
And in this, you're a grandmother, you're a mother, you're a pregnant teenager, and you're, you know, a man who's very different even from other people in his family. I mean, and you do it really well. I mean, can you talk a little bit about freeing your imagination to do that, and how you feel like we begin to navigate the difficulty of this moment with regard to, you know, life as writers?
Well, I think the question that I always ask myself is, of all my characters, is, am I allowing this character to be fully human? Or are they playing, you know, some role in the protagonist's life or some role in the novel? And, you know, of course, there's going to be some tertiary characters who are just there to play a role, you know, like the police officer who pulls Yolanda over when she's speeding, or, you know, but I do try as much as possible to think about how everyone is a full human being. And yeah, I mean, it's not a very satisfying answer, but I guess the question is, when writing from the experience of someone who isn't you, is like, do you do it well? Do you pull it off? Right. And it's when we don't pull it off that that readers notice that the work suffers. But you know, I also think we should try to. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard.
It is hard. I mean, Grace Paley used to talk about, and I'm repeating it now because it always stuck with me, writing the truth according to the character and thinking really about what was true for this person in their life, not about what did I think as the author. And I think about it so much also, and this comes through in your book too, in terms of their socioeconomic lives. How is a person's life different if they have no money, if they live in this way, if they come from this history, and really allowing that, what I can discern from their experience and from what I know of their history, to inform me. But it is interesting because we're talking today about, you can't, you know, to inhabit the sort of consciousness of another or the weight of the history they carry is complicated. And yet I agree with you. I think unless we only want to read books that reflect, you know, our same visage back to ourselves, or we only want to sort of find that reflection, then we're kind of stymied. And it's, to me, the whole reason to read and write is to have the world expand. But it's difficult. Do you, with your students, do exercises that are sort of specific to tapping into the imagination? I'm sure we have a lot of our students here. And I know that for people who've worked so hard to sort of achieve a level of academic success, sometimes they get to us and they're like, I forgot how to use the imagination, or that's considered lying. And I'm like, well, lie really well. You know?
I mean, that's our job, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Time travelers and liars incorporated. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I do give writing exercises because I find that students want them, generative writing exercises. I never liked them as a student. And so for years, I didn't give my students in-class writing exercises because I thought that it was just the professor trying to fill space. But over and over in my evaluations, I would hear, you know, more exercises, please. So I do it. I am very committed to giving revision exercises and to help my students sort of see where they can expand the story and see where they can find new opportunities and new questions and new complexities. And you know, I give them exercises that are sort of formalized versions of what I do myself when I'm revising.
It's so funny that you said that, because literally I was just trying to, I have a whole question here. I was about revision because I want to hear more about that, because I think one of the hardest things to teach is learning how to read one's own work and have a sense of, oh, here's what's not working, or here's what's wrong with it. And then, you know, I sort of talk to the students about how there's many layers to revision. It's not like I just go through it one more time and clean it up. But I'm curious both what your own process is and what kind of exercises you give.
Well, I mean, I'm revising constantly. So by the time I finally, I mean, I was working on the novel for years before I finally actually got to the end and had a complete draft. But in that time, I'd been revising for years and sharpening the story and figuring out who the characters are. So I love revising. I mean, I sort of feel like, you know, when you're drafting, you're sort of creating the clay, and then once you have the material, you get to shape it in any way you want and really clarify things. Well, so one of the you asked about Amadeo earlier, and
absolutely.
So when I turned that story in for my first workshop in graduate school, and it was pretty polished when I turned it in. You know, I had concerns about it, but it was polished. And my mentor and advisor, Ehud Havazelet, who was a brilliant writer, and a really dear mentor, said, "You're not deep. You're going deep enough. You have to go deeper." And I got home from workshop and I was like, "What does that mean? How do I go deeper?" You know, it felt so vague and so I didn't know how to do it, and it was, so I struggled with it for a long time. And so one of the things I ended up doing to go deeper is, you know, I think all of our characters have things that they do not want to reveal to themselves, to the other characters in the story, and certainly to the reader. And so one of the, I think, our job as writers is to sort of identify what that thing is and then make them reveal it. And so one of the exercises I give my students is to just write the dialogue between the character and a really combative therapist. And, you know, and just don't worry about the, you know, it's just dialogue. And I think sometimes important knowledge does grow out of that exercise. And it did for me with Amadeo. The dialogue didn't make it in.
Yeah, it's like an intervention. I mean, I do a thing where I'm like, you know, interview them or ask them what's going on, or what's holding them back, or why they're slowing down the progress of the book, or, you know, like, because there are times you can feel like, and I can see this in Amadeo in a, I mean, this is a positive, but you think he's dragging his feet because he doesn't want to deal with certain things. And it's fascinating when you're writing, and I've had this before, when you're writing a character who sort of resists being known and resists revealing themselves to you, and you have to sort of say, you know, hey, mister, what's going on here? And it is really, really interesting. And I realized with one of them, it was a character who he really didn't know himself. And so that was the resistance. And then only as I kept writing further into the book, and as he came to know himself, it was easier to write. And it's funny because people are like, well, you're making the whole thing up anyway. So what does that mean? You know, he doesn't know himself. And it is interesting how, I mean, these people are real. The people in your book, I mean, and you render them so well. They seem to me, I'm like, as though I could just drive down there and find them and, you know, visit. They'd be horrified, you know. But yes, yeah, it is digging deeper, is that hard thing of sort of unpacking them and allowing them to unpack themselves. I think Dorothea's here. Maybe we have some time for some questions. I have, of course, a million more, but let's see. I'm sure a lot of people have things they want to ask you.
Yeah, how great to listen to the two of you, though, and you know, this really wide-ranging conversation of yours covering craft and also beginning to reveal the many themes of this amazing novel. Though I prefer your term, actually, they're threads, really, because it never has that heavy-handed feeling of, oh, she's covering teenage pregnancy and alcoholism, and you know, it never ever is like that. It's all so much written from within the experience. So I think thread is a much better word for that. So there are a few questions in the queue, and I glanced at them and see that your conversation has also in some ways caught up to some of them. So a couple of them might just be occasions to expand a little bit on what you've already been talking about. And AM, if there are more questions that also you still want to interweave, by all means, go ahead and do that. So this is just an occasion to also invite all of you, if you have other things sort of scratching at the back of your head, add them to the queue. The question that has been sitting here longest comes from Victoria Weisfeld, who loved your Glimmer Train interview of a couple years ago, Kirstin, about finding the end of your stories and then working backwards. And she's asking herself if she understood this right and if this is still part of your method.
Well, thank you for reading that. I actually don't exactly remember what I said or what I was thinking, but I think what I probably was thinking was that sometimes I never know where a story's going to go. I wish I did. I don't outline. I never have a clear plan. And so it really is this sort of path of discovery. But sometimes, often, I do sort of know the emotional arc, and so where I want the character to end up emotionally. And sometimes I've had final scenes. In the story, The Five Wounds, I knew basically what the last scene was going to be. In my story, The Guest House, I knew basically what the last scene was going to be, but I didn't quite know how to get the character to that emotional place. And so that was sort of the work of writing.
Do you work from the end sometimes, Am?
No, I mean, so I shouldn't say no. Yes and no. You know, and very similarly, I think I have a sense of the emotional place I want to leave the characters. And I also talk about this in class, and I'm curious if you do, that there's also a difference sometimes between where I want to leave the reader and where I want to leave the characters, and that's okay. They can sort of be left in different places. And then sometimes I think a lot, and I'm sure you do as well, what do I have to do to get to that moment? You know, what do I have to explore to get there? I'm curious, in the land of things you've said before, I also read a quote where you talked about what fuels my fiction is uncertainty and not understanding things. And I'm writing into uncertainty. And I found that terrifying. And I want to know, how do you write into uncertainty? Because I think we're all doing it, but it just sounded scary.
It is sometimes, often. I mean, uncertainty, it's also, maybe it's less scary to say I'm writing into my curiosity, you know. I want to know how things will end for these characters. I want to know how their relationships will change. And it's only because I don't know that I'm engaged with the writing and that I can actually finish it. Right. I think if I did know, then it would just feel like I was, you know, filling in the blanks, and and it wouldn't have have enough urgency to get me through the
and
project.
also that process of knowing also it goes back to the question of depth, because there is the kind of writing or sometimes sort of an early draft of something where it's still sitting on the surface and there isn't enough exploration of what is going on, and so that's the digging deeper. Yeah. Dorothea, do we have another question from the audience?
Yeah, well, there are several questions, and I'm going to sort of wrap two together because they both are interested in the Catholicism in the book. One coming from Mary Grace asking, can you talk about the sacramental imagination in the story? And then Susan Wheeler, I think this relates, so maybe you want to respond to the two of them together. Amadeo's identification with the penitente responsibility, at least to the Passion, seems a kind of opening for him as a character. Can you talk more about bringing penitente devotion into the book? So both devotion and the sacramental imagination in the Five Wounds.
Those are really challenging questions. You know, I think I wanted this book. The central dynamic in this book is the relationship between Amadeo and Angel, and how that relationship evolves over the course of this year. And you know, it really is. It's a reconciliation, and so I think that idea was always in my mind. And you know, of course, reconciliation is a sacrament in the Catholic Church. It's, you know, confession, and it's sort of the way in which you can make changes. You confess, you get absolution, and then you get to turn over a new page. And I think that that's a really beautiful part of Catholicism, and you know, part that I really value. And you know, I think I think penance is also about leading to reconciliation. It's making an accounting of the ways we've wounded each other, and making that right, or you know, maybe not making it right, but doing our best to make amends for that. Yeah, and you know, I'm always interested in how. I'm really interested in story in general, just the way we interact with received stories. When I first started writing, I read a lot of Angela Carter and her retellings of fairy tales, and I've worked with folk tales in my fiction and saints' lives, and I'm really interested in how characters engage with story, and how, you know, this very well-known story of Christ's death and resurrection, birth, death, and resurrection. I'm interested in how characters, you know, interact with different elements of that story. I just lost my headphone. But you know, how different elements will become more salient depending on the particular needs of that character in the moment.
I myself, on the topic of penance, found with Amadeo, part of what was so compelling is that, you know, you're saying there's this effort of making it right, and he always falls short, right? So there's this effort to do penance, but he doesn't quite ever get there. And so I actually really was fascinated by the fact that you always hold open that space where the thing that is promised by this practice, you approach, you know, the reward of it is, he never quite gets it, and yet he continues, right? He renews himself somehow each time. So it's
yeah,
really...
I mean, oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, go for it.
I mean, you're right. Like, Amadeo will never make up for the fact that he was not in his daughter's life for 15 years. Like, how can he? That was 15 years of his absence. But yeah, all he can do is try to start again.
Yeah, right. Again and again.
And again.
Yeah, again, yeah. There are a couple more questions here that return to AM's line of questioning about how much you have to be the character that you write, and are in particular interested in whether it's harder for you to write from a woman's point of, from a man's point of view than from a woman's point of view.
I don't know that that's the case. I mean, it's true that I often write from the point of view of women. I think Amadeo was challenging for me not because he was a man, but because of his you know, challenges, his personal challenges. The fact that he's an alcoholic and he caught in that sort of trap of addiction for so much of the book, that was a challenge for me. And, you know, sort of emotionally, it's hard to be with the pain that he bears. But no, you know, I think we're all people. I mean, of course, these parts of our identities, you know, matter so much to how we're perceived in the world and what our experiences are in the world, you know, our gender, race, ethnicity, age, all of that, sexuality. But we are all people, you know, we've all felt loneliness and joy and love. And, you know, so I think that, yeah.
I also liked AM's characterization of your writing as being written with a kind of anthropologist's eye. And so this kind of, you know, we also all bear intimate witness without being what we're witnessing. And that too, I think, becomes a resource. We're close to the top of the hour. AM, I wanted to ask if you have a final question that you'd like to ask.
I have so many final questions, but
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. I guess one of them would be just to that idea of penance or atonement. I think I mean, I'm like, my favorite holiday is Yom Kippur, where you repent for things even that you might not have done, things that other people have done or that you heard about, or, you know, all kinds of things. But I'm curious if in some ways you also see the act of writing as sort of, if not, you know, it's making amends, it's doing a kind of penance. I don't know. I think that's really potentially interesting, but I don't know if you experience it ever that way at all.
I mean, absolutely. I think sometimes I use writing to try to understand people in my life who maybe I don't understand or feel I've failed or have failed me. You know, I do think it's a way of sort of bridging some of those gaps.
Can I ask you the classic question, which is, what are you working on now? That's my last question.
You know, when I was working on this book, I had this idea for another novel, and I was researching it, and I'd written it. I wrote some pages of it, and the whole time I was like, God, I wish I could be done with the 5 wounds, because this other book is so fun. And then the minute I was done, I was like, it's not quite as interesting as I thought it was. I mean, I'll go back to it. Right now I'm working on stories, which feels really, really fun.
That is fantastic. I can't wait to read them. It's such a joy to spend time with you, Dorothea. It's such a joy to be here at Labyrinth. I want to say also that bookstores redefine what carryout is during this pandemic. You know?
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I mean, it's a second to being in the space with you, but I've actually been grateful during this year for the fact that there is a substitute, and that we can connect in this other way. It's not nothing, and especially when the, you know, in a case like tonight, when you bring this sort of directness and intimacy, it's actually quite wonderful. And so, thank you to both of you for this time, thinking together, talking together. Thank you to everyone out there who has listened in. And again, I invite you to also register to hear Jhumpa Lahiri talk about her new novel with Alessandro Giammei, a novel that she wrote in Italian and translated herself into English. So that's on May 3rd. But for now, most importantly, find a copy of The Five Wounds. You will just be absorbed by these characters and the many questions that that they help you think about and think through. So with that, thank you to everybody. Good wishes, good health, and I hope to see you soon, both of you. If you're in Princeton, when you're back in Princeton, I look forward to seeing you. So good night. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.